This is my 88th video on my work with OO gauge. See part 1 of this series for my reasons for getting into OO gauge when I already had a lot invested in working in N gauge and I didn't really have space available for a large, fully operational OO gauge layout. Also see my lengthy series on my N gauge railway modelling for smaller and more complex scenery and smaller scale trains running. This part is a return to the subject of controllers, since I picked up another one, which I think will be very useful to me, a Morley Vortrak. There will be running demonstration using the Vortrak at the end. Just a brief diversion before getting on to the Vortrak, progress on the shelf layout. After I painted the top layer of the shelves, it seemed kind of silly the way the bottom layer stood out in white. So I took all the pieces down again and painted the edges and the ends of the pieces on the bottom layer. I think this does look better. Here's the other arm along the wall past the window to the far end where the second station is intended to be. Now the back scene for this just arrived in the post while I was in the process of making this video, so my next task will be to try to put that up, which is going to be a real challenge where I have to work leaning right over the existing Hornby layout. Frankly, I'm dreading trying to do that. But I'll do my best, and once the issue of the back scene is settled, I can fix the shelf pieces into place more permanently and deal with some of the issues where sections don't quite line up neatly. I still haven't received the shuttle controllers, so I'm going to have to wait for those before I can really proceed with setting up the control board and the wiring for the shelf layout. Anyway, one step at a time. Now back to the Vortrak. I wasn't really looking actively for this. I had looked at Morley controllers and I definitely felt that they were something that I would like to try should it be possible. But Morley only sell them configured for UK and European mains input, and I wasn't inclined to order one and then try to figure out how to operate it from the mains here in Canada where I live, which are 120 volt 60 cycles as opposed to the 230 volt 50 cycles in the UK. I thought the UK was 240, but I just looked it up and apparently officially it's 230 now. Anyway, this unit just turned up at British Model Trains, my local supplier for railway modelling things British. Nigel had acquired it with a whole collection and layout that he purchased. Since it just popped up like that when I saw it, I immediately asked Nigel if I could buy it from him. He checked it out to make sure it was actually functional, quoted me a price, and I brought it home with me this past weekend, along with some other things for my shelf layout. Here's the main control panel of the Vortrak. I just have to comment on that name, which I find slightly amusing. I could be wrong, but it seems to me that Morley decided to make a 4-track controller sometime after they launched their line. Their signature controller is the Morley Vector, and they also now have a Vesta and a Vanguard. All of those are 2-track controllers. I think that at some point they decided to make a 4-track version and said to themselves, what shall we call it? They'd sort of established the idea of the names of their controllers starting with V, but they couldn't think of a good word beginning with V for this one, so they just changed the F of 4-track and came up with Vortrak, which sounds vaguely like a villain in a Bond movie. In any case, if that is so, it was quite a while ago, as the Vortrak has been in Morley's line for a good many years, although it's less well known than the Vector. The one that I acquired is a somewhat older unit, since it's labelled 04, and I believe the ones they sell now are labelled 010. I think mine dates back to somewhere around 2010-2012, possibly even older. The overall outer look of the controller doesn't really seem to have changed much over all the different versions. They have a solid, almost blockish, wedge-like construction with a plastic box and a metal face. Changes seem to have been minor things in the nature of the knobs and maybe some internal electrical changes, but I've no idea what. The actual arrangement of the controls, switches and lights on the panel doesn't seem to have changed. And the Vortrak has basically exactly the same controls and indicators as the Vector, except for the difference in the number of tracks controlled. There's a knob on the panel for each track to be controlled to control loco speed. These are two-way knobs turned one way for forward and the other way for backward, with the off position at top center, so there are no direction reversal switches. There's also no detente in the off position, which is an unfortunate omission as it makes it a little hard to bring a loco neatly and surely to a stop if you're operating the control knob without actually looking at the controller, as will generally be the case, because you're mostly looking at the train, not at the controller. Each knob has an indicator light above it, and these light up green when power is being applied in the forward direction and red when power is being applied in the reverse direction. Above the indicator lights for each track there's a DIN socket to allow the connection of the wire from a handheld controller. Next to each DIN socket is a switch, which must be operated to switch control between the handheld controller and the onboard knob. Control for any track is always either the handheld or the onboard, and when one is selected, the position of the other has no effect. There is one final indicator light in the center of the board, and this is labeled Points CDU. CDU stands for Capacitor Discharge Unit. A capacitor is charged, and when a momentary point switch connected to the CDU connector is operated, the power comes from that capacitor. I don't have any motorized points on my Hornby layout, so I haven't tried this and can't comment on how well it works. The board is marked in the corners siphonic cooling. I have no idea what this means. Hopefully it means that the controller won't overheat. Here are the connections on the back of the controller. They're not exactly laid out as you might initially expect. For example, there's no direct relation between the position of the control knobs and the position of the connectors that they control. However, as you may see, there is a label that indicates fairly clearly how the connectors are arranged. My unit has 2 connector strips, each with 10 connections, so 5 pairs of connectors on each strip. The strip on the left, as seen here, is for the track connections. The first pair of connectors is not used, and the remaining 4 pairs of connectors provide the power for tracks 1 to 4, from left to right, as seen here. On the right-hand strip, as seen here, the first pair of connectors are for the point CDU, and the next 2 pairs each provide uncontrolled 12-volt DC 1A outputs for accessories, and the right-hand 2 pairs are not used. There is no AC output from this controller. The unit that I acquired appears to have been a unit sold for UK or European use, which hasn't been modified other than to change the plug on the mains lead to a North American-style heavy-duty 3-pin plug. The unit came with this separate transformer, which was obviously being used to operate it. This is a simple step-up, step-down transformer which converts AC from a variety of possible input voltages to provide 110 and 220-volt outputs. It will, of course, not change the frequency, but that's not really important in this case as the Morley controllers are designed to provide fully rectified DC output. Here's the back of the step-up, step-down transformer. As you may see, it can be used with 110-volt, 200-volt, 220-volt or 240-volt input. A simple plug-in bridge connector is used to select the input voltage. This is currently in the 110-volt slot to correspond with North American mains voltage. By plugging the Vortrak into the 220-volt output socket of this transformer, the Vortrak can be operated pretty much as it would function in the UK. The Vortrak came with 2 handheld control units. These plug into the board of the main controller using DIN plugs. They come with very long wires, 5 meters, so it's possible to move quite a way away from the main controller whilst using the handheld controller to operate a train, although you do of course have to deal with a fairly heavy wire trailing after you. Although the Vortrak is a 4-track controller, it only comes with 2 handheld units. This is standard and is still the case with the units that Morley sell today. Additional handheld units can be purchased from Morley. I see that the current price for a handheld unit with a 5-meter cord is £18.95, including post within the UK. By the way, the price for the current non-crawler version of the Vortrak is £164.90, again including shipping within the UK. Here's a close-up of the connectors on the board for the handheld units. The bottom indicator on the DIN plug needs to be orientated towards the left. To control the track using the handheld unit, the switch next to the DIN socket needs to be flipped up into the handheld position. My unit has no détente for the off position on either the main board knobs or the handheld units. I gather that Morley added détentes on the handheld units at some point, and then at a later point I believe they also added détentes on the main knobs. Here's a view of the back of the controller from a slightly lower angle, showing how the wires actually need to be inserted into the connectors. These connectors are a bit awkward to use. When the controller is stood on a surface, as it normally would be, you can see the small screws used to tighten the connectors quite clearly, but you can't see the holes into which the wires need to go as these face downwards. They're also quite small holes with little spring-loaded tabs in them, which makes inserting the wire rather tricky. It shouldn't be a problem for robust single-strand wire, but multi-strand wire really needs to be tinned with solder to work well with these connectors. On balance, I'd say these connectors are not as easy to use as the connectors on the Hamilton Morgan Duet, which uses large knurled knobs, allowing the wires to be easily connected without tools. However, I prefer the Morley connectors to those used by MRC, which have large flat-headed screws under the heads of which you need to fit the connecting wire. The MRC connectors are fine if your wires end in spade connectors, otherwise they're a real pain. These Morley connectors work quite well so long as your wires have thin, rigid ends that can be pushed into the holes. You do need a small flat-headed screwdriver to make the connections, and as I say, getting the wires into the holes with the controller sat on a table is tricky as you can't see the holes, unless you turn the controller to stand on its front, which it doesn't really very readily do. Here's a view of the Vortrak after I actually connected it up to my Hornby layout. You can see on the back of the controller the holes in the connectors where the tightening screws are located. You can't see the holes that the wires go into as those face downward. I only have connections made to connectors 3, 4, 5 and 6 counting from the right. This represents connection of the inner and outer sections of my Hornby layout to track 1 and track 2 on the Vortrak. I'm thinking that when I get my shelf layout running, I will be able to also connect that to the Vortrak as tracks 3 and 4. Here's a view of the Vortrak where I currently have it sitting next to my Hornby layout. This may change a bit in future as I will need an additional control panel for the features of the shelf layout. The white things under the layout are plastic storage units for rolling stock. So now let's see a little video of the Morley Vortrak actually controlling trains on my Hornby layout. The trains are still those using the old Locos and the simplex coupled rolling stock that I demonstrated in parts 83, 84 and 86. These are perhaps not really the best things with which to test out the Vortrak, but on the other hand, if it can operate these old Locos with awkward trains, it shouldn't have any problem with newer Locos. Morley specifically say that their controllers are ideal for coreless motors, which seem to be increasingly common in newer Locos. Anyway, on to the demonstration. Okay, let's just see if we can demonstrate the Vortrak operating the Hornby layout. Now we've got it connected up. I've got the tracks connected to 1 and 2, so currently nothing is connected to 3 and 4. The idea is to use those for the shelf layout when the shelf layout's built, but that's a way to go yet. The shelf's there, but there's nothing on it. I believe track 1 is the input track, the inner track. Now that's these are still the very old engines. On this engine tends to take a bit of power to start. It tends to start with a jerk. That's not the fault of the Morley controller. That's the nature of that. That's the nature of that engine. It's an old Wren engine. and it just starts. You can't start it other than with a jerk. You've got to give it a fair amount of power to get it started. I actually find the control on the Morley controllers very nice and gentle. The only thing is there's no detente in the middle, so when I want to stop the train like this, famous last words. Well, I didn't mean to stop it there, but that's going to have to do, because I don't think I'm going to go down there and try and poke it. That's not the fault of the Morley controller, it's the fault of a piece of dirt on the track, I think. Let's try the other train. Now this is the little old Triang 3F trying to pull a long, heavy train of wagons, so he has trouble doing it. His wheels are slipping like crazy there as he tries to pull the train away because it's heavy for him. These knobs are quite nice. I just wish they had a detente in the middle. Once more round, maybe. Unlike the Duet, this doesn't have a high and low setting. It really pretty much covers the whole range that the Duet covers in high and low without a separate switch. It can start off pretty low, but it's also got plenty of power. I mean, I didn't go anywhere near to the max there. Okay, I'm going to leave that for a moment. Then I'm just going to demonstrate the handheld controller, which is going to be a bit trickier to demonstrate. Okay, part 2. It's going to be a little hard to really demonstrate using this handheld controller, because everything's going to, it's hard not to get in the way and everything. I'm only doing this for the outside line. I'm not going to demonstrate this on both lines because it's fiddly. Okay, so we're at about 25% there on the handheld controller. And of course it is handheld, it's on a very long wire, I could move it all over the place. The reason I'm not moving it all over the place is that, oops! And we've got a wagon that's derailed. It's nothing to do with the controller, of course. Can I re-rail it? I don't know. Sorry, I'm probably knocking the camera all over the place here. For some reason, I'm not sure whether I've got it re-railed right even then. Maybe I have. It's hard to tell. This sort of thing, demonstrating this sort of thing's hard. There is no detente, you see. This is the problem. Now I gather the latest Morley controllers do have detentes, the latest Morley handholds, but this doesn't. This is an older one, and it does not have a detente. There's no detente on the main controller, no detente on the handheld. I could, as I say, I could move this controller all over the place, but then you wouldn't be able to see it in the camera. Okay. It does seem to have very good fine control over the speed. I'll give it that. I just wish it had a detente in the off position.